Now, for those of you who are just starting us, we are recording now the discussion on the very first chapter of Karen Armstrong's book, The Bible, a Biography. I think probably if we were to have no other chapter to introduce us to holy text from a Judeo-Christian point of view, this chapter probably is one of the most significant because it brings up things that probably most people are not aware of, and it tells you the fault lines that still exist in Judaism and in a way in Christianity. It is not a pleasant chapter in exposing a lot of people, a lot of truths that people wish were not out there. And it's a very, very interesting thing. And by the way, so I can get this right, Roy knows this, I'm sure, but a lot of people are not aware of this, that before the Quran was finally published, it went through a 2 or 3 year editorial process. Most people are not aware of that. We are not told the group who edited. And of course, one of the things that's very important when you're editing, you don't know what point of view editors are bringing with them. There is no such thing, as I found out very, very surprisingly and very naively, there's no such thing as objective editing. Everybody has points of view. And a lot of times what makes it really scary is we're not even aware of the points of view we bring to the table. And I've just finished my first month with world religion classes. And one of the things I said in the very beginning is we have to be aware of, and I say this with no shame at all, our own cultural biases. We grow up in homes, and from those homes, we have certain things that we just assume and we bring with us. And a lot of times we're not even aware of what those are. We really, really aren't. And, you know, I'm aware of that, just to give a biography of it. I did not know, and this comes as a surprise to everybody, I did not know Pat, and I did not know Doug for decades. I didn't know them at all. And I knew of them by name, but didn't know them. And so it turns out I have more in common with my birth father's family than I ever did with my birth's mother. I mean, I fit right in. I was always a square peg in a round hole, but I was in the wrong hole and didn't even know it. And I find that absolutely fascinating. So we bring things to the table, and there are other things we bring with us that are our own ruminations, our own thoughts, and we need to be aware of that. Living in Miami has been very helpful to understand what it means to have your own cultural background and have to watch out for that. It also reminds us there's always more stuff to learn. Now, having said that, let's take a look at, I want to take a look at the very beginning of the chapter 1, when she points out a couple of things that, that really do set the stage in one sense. The second stage is set, by the way, in 1948, when archaeologists will start running amok and digging amok in the new state of Israel. And what they found was not very pleasant to those who assumed that the biblical text they had in front of them in the Hebrew Bible was correct. To make a long story short, a lot of times history is written hundreds of years later from the way you wished it would have been, not necessarily the way it was. Okay. All right, there you go. Throw that in too. Okay, you can see the chat. In 597, by the way, let me start out by saying also, there are certain parts of this planet. I don't know if you've ever really studied geography much, but there's certain parts of this planet, especially in Europe and the Middle East, that are just very, very difficult places to live. The Balkans have had warring tribes almost from the beginning. The Balkans have just been one of those places that are just been a war zone forever between competing tribes and genocides. Another area that has been very tough is that area where the Caucuses. I don't know if any of you, sometimes my ignorance amazes me. I just pulled up a history of the Caucuses a few months ago and was dumbfounded at how long the Caucasus had been occupied by hominids. I've also been amazed at how often these groups have fought amongst themselves in very, very bloody ways. The Caucasus, of course, are, of Chechnya, and you've heard of Armenia and Georgia and other countries, and there is a mountain chain that goes right down, almost splitting the Caucasus in half, except for a tiny bit that goes to the Caspian Sea, and you can go right around it, and that's the only the Armenian genocides. But long before the Armenian genocides, for thousands of years, the Caucasus and the Balkans have been two areas you don't want to live. They've not been good for various tribal reasons. The other area, by the way, is the Eastern Mediterranean. If you take a look at what we now call southern Turkey, the Mediterranean part of Syria, what we now call Lebanon, and now what we call the Israel, long before these got these names, this area was another bad spot to live. And the reason why is you had Egypt below, and if Egypt wanted to wage war, where did you have to go up through to get going? You had to go up along the Mediterranean coast because everything else was desert. So you go up the Mediterranean coast, and if you are Babylon or Assyria or Persia, and you wanted to wage war and you wanted to conquer Egypt, where did you go? You went up, and then you went down the Mediterranean coast, and there were all these little city-states there and all these little countries there, and they got clobbered regularly. And usually, and I hope I'm not being unfair, the people leading these small areas were not always the best people to be leading small areas in conflict zones. So in 597, you had what was left of Israel. Israel, by the way, was and these really weren't 12 tribes. This really was a kind of interesting fiction. There were groups that divided up, but you've got what was basically the land of Canaan. And the land of Canaan had a major series of splits, and 12 quote unquote tribes formed the bigger, larger, more prosperous section. Two small tribes had the city of Jerusalem, and that was about it. And they shared this big valley with the Philistines on the coast, in which you did a lot of olives and a lot of agriculture. And that was basically it. And so, because of bad politics and bad decision-making, when the Assyrians came charging down the coast, the kingdom of Israel decided to join a small group of others to oppose Sennacherib and Tiglath-Pileser III, and they got wiped right out. And in 722, roughly 22,000 of the finest, most intelligent, the leaders of Israel were exiled to what we now call Mosul, the Mosul area. And Assyria had the first real organized, program of when you invaded a country, you got the top leaders, the top priests, the top producers, the top generals, if you didn't kill them, and you moved them to other parts of the empire. This was the first organized that we're aware of, massive deportations from area A to area B. So we're going to do it this way. John is right there, and he is in what we'll now call, we'll call the southern part of the Galilee, just to give us a modern context. He loses, and so we're going to transport John over to Mosul. Nanette Bartel's whole area was in Mosul. We're putting her in the southern part of the Galilee. She knows nothing of the area, nothing of the culture, nothing of the land, nothing of the farming, can't even speak the language. By the same token, John's whole group is over where Nanette used to be, doesn't know the language, doesn't know the people, doesn't know this, and you even smell differently. And I keep on mentioning scents because scents are a big deal. They really, really are. What you do with how you conduct yourself when you don't wash much and things like that has a big deal about how you relate to people. I keep mentioning that. And my classes were saying to me they weren't paying attention to that. And everybody said they'd been in an area where somebody hadn't washed and they suddenly paid attention here. In the last week, you go someplace public and it's very clear somebody hasn't washed and you suddenly pay attention for the first time about scent. So you get this back and forth. And so what you have then in quote unquote former Israel is a mixed population. The very poor who were not deported. This is important to remember because Karen Armstrong mentions this later in the chapter. There were those left behind. A big chunk of peasants were left behind. They were people there. So Nanette's crew moves in, and she represents an upper class and an artisan class, a working class of makers and doers who are now stuck with a bunch of peasants. They didn't speak each other's languages. They didn't speak each other. They knew nothing of each other's cultures, but they're forced to live together. They don't have any weapons. So needs must is an old English phrase, is it not, Ron? Needs must. And you do what you have to do. And to survive, you have to learn how to talk each other's languages. You have to learn how to get along. And that's just the way it is. From that will evolve a very different kind of culture, a different pronunciation of things, a combination of words to make up a different kind of language, a hybrid language, a hybrid. Does this make sense to everybody? You will develop a hybrid system of each other's languages, which is what the English language is, by the way. The English language has got French, Huguenot, Celt, Saxon, and Scots, and Lord knows what else, Gaelic and Druid. It's got all of that. In fact, if you've ever studied the history of London, at one point in London, 1/4 of the population was French Huguenot. 1/4. So if you go to London today, you're going to find a tremendous population of Pakistani, of Caribbean, of Indian. And so London today is still a mix, and you get all those languages, kind of like Miami. All right, having said that then, down in Jerusalem, you get also the same thing. 200 years later, there'll be another rebellion. And guess what? These groups lose to the Babylonians. We lost that first group in 722. We don't know what happened to them. All we guess is that when they went to the Mosul area, that they interbred, settled in, and became very assimilated. I understand now there is DNA, ancient Jewish DNA that they have found in the Mosul area, and they are guessing that must be what would be pre-running of Canaanite, et cetera, that came from 722 BCE. By the way, you'd be amazed what we're finding now about DNA. Okay, Ron just threw up an interesting chat. Did you know, and I may have mentioned this before, DNA is not just found now. This is fascinating. This is in the last 2 years. It's not just found in bones. There's a little section in your ear, in a skull, that they can take DNA from, and they can now take DNA from dirt. They have found, they're sophisticated now enough with, what's the word I want? A sifting. That's not right, though. Filtering. They've got such sophisticated filters now, they can filter out dirt and find DNA in several layers of dirt. Now, this is all new. This is all new in the last couple of 100 years. So our abilities to find DNA are not just limited to skeletons. A skull can give you DNA now, and dirt in caves. And so we're able to find now a lot more about our ancestors than we've ever known before. And what we're finding out is we haven't changed that much in terms of behavior. All right. So then let's recap very quickly. 722, some bad mistakes were made politically, and it ended up with the northern kingdom of Israel being wiped out. It's off the face of the map and has been till 1948. The bottom two little tribes in Jerusalem, 597 and 586, they're wiped off, and they're wiped off to the face of the map. But let me remind everybody just very, very quickly, before there was an Israel and Judah, there was the land of Canaan. And that land basically makes up the DNA overwhelmingly of what later became Israel and Judah. And that's what they found in 1948. Regardless of what the text said, if you want to know who what Israel really was, it's the Canaanites who had other people join in with them. It's like Miami. Miami is a good example. Miami today, you look at Miami, but if you look at the basis of Miami, it's a mix. It's originally Native American. And then from Native American, you get some Spanish. And then they finally, they're here for a very short time. And then you get crackers moving in, and I can say that you can't. I can say that you can't. From my mother's side of the family, may she rest in peace. Then you get others moving in, Bahamians, and let's not forget African Americans. Yeah, we forget that. African Americans were here very, very importantly, and so were Bahamians. Bahamians bring a different culture than African American. And those of you who live in Miami know that there's a big deal of difference between islanders and African American. And culturally, DNA-wise, and way you approach things. I'll give you a quick aside of this. When I was teaching it at FIU, I had lots of students who represented islander mentality and background, and those who were African American. It was very interesting. The islanders were colorblind. They did not see people in terms of black and white or black and white or whatever. They just saw people. And so you found islanders dating and going out with people. They didn't think anything about color. I would say to my African-American girls, you sit home every week, all the time in the dorm. Why don't you go out? And I remember, and by the way, most of them are still in touch with me, interesting enough, on Facebook. They're still single. They're now in their mid-30s, mid to late 30s, and they say to me, we can't. It's not our culture. I said, the black boys are not going out with you. They're not dating you. You're going to sit home. Why don't you go out? You've had several white guys ask you, why don't you go out? We can't do it. Islanders are colorblind. But the African-American in the South, let me put this in the South. Let me be very clear. In the North, no. In California, no. But in the South, it's still a very, very, very different culture here. Very, very different. Okay, now you go then to Israel, and you're going to find, ancient Israel, you're going to find the group that goes to Mosul, they're assimilated and gone. But the group that remains still has its ties to the land. Former Canaanites, now they're Israel. Other groups have moved in. Semi-nomads have moved in from the north and from the east. Semi-nomads from the east, from the desert, and from the north, southern Turkey. If you ever study the story of Abraham, he starts out in Iraq, what modern day Iraq. He skirts along southern Turkey and then comes down the coast. Now, there's a very famous story in the Genesis where Abraham passes off his wife as his sister. And I remember making great fun of this and thinking how bad this was and what a wuss he was, until it's unearthed now. I feel so embarrassed. When he stayed in southern Turkey, that was the Hittite Empire. And listen what they did. In the Hittite Empire, your wife was not allowed to inherit your property. So what a lot of men did is they adopted their wives as their sisters, making them members of the family so their wife could inherit property. Did you get that? You know what I'm saying? That was brilliant. You love your wife. The law says your wife can't inherit your property, but your family can. So you adopt your wife as your sister. And so now she's your family, so she can inherit your property. I thought that was a brilliant move, a loophole, folks. So when Abraham says, this is my sister, he was being honest because he had to pass her off as his sister so it could be very clear that when he died, she could inherit his property. Thanks to archaeology, we now understand what that was all about. In the southern kingdom, this is where it gets really tacky. Several thousand are deported to Babylon. And with these people that go to Babylon, they bring texts and scrolls. But the scrolls were just scrolls. They had writings and stuff like that. But the idea was there was no big deal. These were just scrolls that were found. Some of them were found when Josiah was cleaning out the temple. Which is a famous story. Josiah was cleaning out the temple in Jerusalem. And guess what? He found, you're going to hope you love this, he found cults of prostitution, male and female. Yes, male cults of prostitution in the famous Jewish temple. So there's this big passage in Kings where Josiah throws out the cults of prostitution, male and female. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting thought. I wonder how many people buried that one. And they found this old storeroom. Seriously, they found an old storeroom. And in this storeroom are scrolls that had been brought down from refugees from the northern kingdom when the Assyrians were invading. They didn't know what to do with the scrolls, so they put them in a storeroom. So Holly and AJ and Annette, Melissa, and John are fleeing the Assyrians. They bring with them writings. Here is Pat, Maureen, and Roy, and Ron, and Ray sitting there and go, what the hell are we supposed to do with these scrolls? Me being the high priest said, I don't know what they are. Store them away someplace. And that's exactly what happened. They got stored. Okay, jump now, 100 years later. And what happens? We're now what? We're in exile. And somebody brought these scrolls along that nobody paid attention to. And we've got them. So where we are, we're now exiles. It's in the middle of the 500s. We're in Babylon and we're still missing the temple. Because our identity was we had the temple, and those, you know what's in the north of Israel, which got wiped out, serves them right. We survived them by 200 years. We at least had the temple. Now we don't. We don't have the temple. What are you going to do? There is no temple. It's been destroyed. What are you going to do? So here we are in Babylon, several thousand of us, and we're divided into groups. We'll get to that in a minute. We're divided into groups. Yes, Bob Marley saying that's a psalm, By the Rivers of Babylon. And actually, by the way, yes, they were homesick, but a couple of things happened. And this is important too. Did everybody get exiled to Babylon? No. And this becomes a big deal. Here's what happens. Doug, Karen Paul, Ray, and Bobby Vance are still left behind. They are left behind. They were members of the former little kingdom of Judah, tiny that it was, and they're left behind. They've got a destroyed city, a destroyed temple, and they do the best they can. Some other refugees will be brought in. Some people will migrate down from the north who were formerly from Mosul. And so peasants meet peasants, needs must, and you blend your flocks and herds, you intermarry, and you do the best you can. It's important to honor, and I really mean this because nobody seems to take serious except Karen Armstrong. You need to honor those who stayed behind and survived. Who stayed behind and survived and did the best they could with almost nothing to help them out. Those who stayed behind in the northern kingdom of Israel, they hybrided. They made an intermarriage. They learned new languages, new ways of surviving. And those who were down in Judah, in the ruins of Jerusalem, they survived the best they could. They will grow slowly. They will grow flocks and herds. They will begin some primitive agriculture, and they will begin to put a life together until 100 and some years later, when we now have exiles return from Babylon. And this will cause a major, major, major problem. Now, let's start then. Let's go to page 2. The sacred writings that the exiles from Jerusalem brought with them in 586, they were writings, but they weren't sacred in the sense that they will become sacred. They were missing their temple. Then they would get priests like Ezekiel. Has anybody ever heard of Ezekiel? Ezekiel,
of course,
had these visions. Should I read one of your visions from Ezekiel? Has any of you ever heard that some of the stuff he did? This guy would go out and, you know, Orthodox Jews forbid people to read beginnings of Ezekiel till you were 30 years old, which means you were late middle-aged, because they found them too disturbing. Let me share with you, since you all need to be disturbed, what Ezekiel saw as a vision. Do let me read this to you. Imagine you are now in an exile in a foreign land. You are probably either born a priest, you would be born in a priestly family. I'm not sure how old Ezekiel really was when he saw these visions, but he was certainly an exile and he was considered a priest. And so he says, I looked up, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually. And in the middle of the fire, something like gleaming amber, and the middle of it, something like 4 living creatures. Now, imagine me coming to you next Saturday and saying, ooh, I had a vision. I saw this thing, flashing fire. Ooh, and there were like something like 4 living creatures.
And we'd accuse you of eating magic mushrooms.
Or worse. Somebody would be thinking, Claus, did you relapse? You haven't had a drink in 20-some years. Did you relapse? Claus, did you have some devil's lettuce?
No, perhaps visions were more accepted back then as normal course rather than a psychiatric disorder. I don't think they had the concept of psychiatric disorder so much.
Well, I'm not sure about that, Danny. I'm not sure. I think this was so weird that this was considered even weird back then. Let me continue. Each had 4 faces. I love this one. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. So Roy Martin, I want you all to look at Roy this morning as the sun has come up. Roy now has 4 faces and 4 wings. Stand up, Roy. Stand up. We want to see the wings. All right, now imagine Roy there with 4 wings and 4 faces. I love this. I love this. What a class. All right, moving right along. Roy, I'm glad to point out that your legs are straight, but the soles of your feet were like the soles of a calf. And they sparkled. Ooh, dudes, they sparkled. Now, Roy, you need to get up again. This is really too good. No, Ron, you need to get up. This is good. This fits you. Ron, get up. All right, now you see, just stand, put your wings out, put your wings out. Now imagine that under there is a hand. Listen to this. There's a hand on each side, a hand. Now look there, see hands. It says here, under the wings on their 4 sides, they had human hands. Dudes, this is seriously, seriously something. All right, thank you, Ron. In my class, when we actually met face to face, I would get a student stand up, and then I'd say, I need to borrow another student. I need to be sure this is appropriate so I don't get in trouble. So you'd always get 2 guys who were good friends, and we do the hands, the living hands under the wings, and kids would go nuts. So I have one guy with 1 set of hands, another guy with another set of hands, and one guy with hands underneath. And the class would say, where are you reading this from? I said, the Holy Bible, Ezekiel chapter 1. They said, you're kidding. So somebody with the phones would go up. People would look at Ezekiel and say, my God, it's there. I said, folks, I can't make up something like this. I may have some imagination. I may able to do weasel pass and wretched sin and tortilla flats, but I can't do this. Seriously. As for the appearance of their face, the face had the face of a human being, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures. Now, I'm not finished yet. This is way too good. The rim of the wheel. The rims were tall and awesome, for the rims of all 4 were full of eyes. Imagine a rim of a wheel with eyes all around the rim. Now, I'm trying to imagine somebody going before an ordination committee And they said, can you tell us your religious experience? And somebody said, do you really want to know? I had this vision. And sharing a vision similar to this, and I'm trying to imagine an ordination committee processing something like this. What is fascinating in all of this, by the way, is somebody decided to write this down. I mean, obviously, while I'm overwhelmed by this, somebody wrote this down. Evidently, Ezekiel had enough of a presence and enough of a reputation that when he said this happened, they decided they better write it down just in case. Now, I don't know about you. That's a good insurance policy. I'm serious about that. You know, when people say things, I get students asking me all the time, do you believe that? And I said, you know, when you get to be my age, which I call post-antique, you've seen so many things that you've taught that are now wrong, so many things that are obsolete, nothing surprises me. When I now see there may be multiple universes, when I see that our galaxy is a mid-size blah galaxy compared to others, then I read the following. I think I mentioned this to you before. Oh, what did I do with it? Oh, please, don't tell me. Yeah, here we go. Tim Maudlin says he came up with a whole new way of looking at time. And the way we're looking at time is obsolete, doesn't make sense in the real world. Black holes are no longer holes. It turns out the latest work shows that black holes are, in fact, are you ready for this, dark stars loaded with exotic matter. We've looked at them wrong. And those of you who ever studied physics knows that Higgs boson, this was supposed to be a particle that everybody says was BS. And then they had that big thing that they made was in Switzerland. And they found out by accident it exists. Ron, you're into this stuff. Can you help us out with that? Ron?
Yeah, it's the Large Hadron Collider.
That's it. I couldn't remember the word collider. Yes.
Yeah, in Switzerland. And they discovered the Higgs boson, which, you know, was postulated, but nobody had ever been able to see it.
Yeah, and the guy who postulated this, everybody thought was an idiot. And he got dumped with heaps of abuse. So just think of all the things you studied in high school. Remember all those exams we took and sweated over? Remember all those? I remember them vividly. Turns out all this stuff is wrong. I remember a physics professor saying it is impossible for two things to occupy the same space at the same time, period. Nuclear fission threw that out the window. All right. And I'm remembering all this other stuff. And I remember, by the way, and I like science, so don't misunderstand me. I remember seeing the words theory and hypothesis. And I can't tell you how many times I would raise my hand and say, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. This is a theory. It's only a theory. And the professor giving me a bottle of junk, and it was only a hypothesis that I said, it's important, but it could be wrong, and being laughed at and made fun of. Well, it turns out a lot of the stuff I thought could have been wrong turned out to be wrong. So I like science, but science tries to keep an open mind. That's what a hypothesis is, isn't it? It's a possibility that something else may come along. All right, Danny, explain the difference between hypothesis and theory. Unmute, go ahead. Danny, where are you? Does somebody want to help us out? The difference between hypothesis and theory.
A hypothesis is more like a single thought.
Okay.
Whereas a theory is a stitching together of many hypotheses that have not been proven to be false, right? In science, we always talk about falsifiability. You put something out there, and if it withstands other scientists trying to prove it wrong, it lives on for a while, but then something else will come to replace it. So you might have a single hypothesis, but then when you have a lot of these hypotheses that seem to be fairly accurate, you can stitch them together into a larger theory.
Okay. And that would explain why you have the documentary hypothesis that I sent to you, and why they said there was a hypothesis stitched together, but now they found it doesn't work. Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
And I'll just add sort of a theory is sort of a hypothesis or a set of hypotheses that have been fairly well tested and long accepted. It doesn't mean that they'll never never be superseded by a better theory. They very well could be. But hypothesis, well, somebody came up with an idea. It's not completely ridiculous. It's plausible, but it really hasn't been tested yet.
Now, what's going to be interesting is, by the way, we have that new telescope out.
James Webb.
Yes, and I'll be fascinated to see what we learn from that. And that still doesn't answer the question. And I asked this question decades ago, and I don't know if I was being a smartass or I was onto something. I said, what if we had the Big Bang in all of this? But Big Bangs are cyclical. You have a Big Bang, then you have a collapses, then you have a Big Bang. This is all a bunch of ongoing cycles. And the idea of multiple universes, I don't think that's nuts either. And of course, any of you read The Hitchhiker's Galaxy to the Universe know about 42, which I think is one of the great reminders of how to keep.
Yes, the answer to life, the universe, and everything.
Yes, I'll never forget that one page. Those of you who didn't read that, there was the great question. It's a funny question too. What is the answer to the universe? Which is a strange question. So I think it was 10,000 generations later, this giant mainframe kind of comes to life again, and there's this massive crowd. And they asked him, says, do you have the answer? And the mainframe answers back, yes. Well, you're not going to like it. Tell us. No, I don't think so. You're not going to like it. Tell us, a big screaming and yelling. And there's dead quiet. 42. There's dead silence. And somebody screams, 42! That's it! And the mainframe says, I told you, you weren't going to like it. And I suspect a lot of this stuff about you that you and I see is kind of like that. We see stuff, we think it's going to be something, and we get answers we don't understand. And I suspect that with the new telescope out there, with the James Webb, we're getting a lot more information. And the more we dig up, we get more information. So that's why I said nothing surprises me. When my students ask me, is this possible? I said, you never know. And it's good to keep an open mind. And so I think and they said, really? I said, yeah. I said, you're going to work at what works for you to keep you grounded, sane. What makes you you? What gives you a sense of how you process stuff? You're going to keep on working that till it works. And then until it doesn't. And then you do it again. And life is a journey of trying to find out how we ground ourselves and stuff around us based upon experiences. And I tell my students something very simple. Now, Ned is now 18. I said to Net in class, I said, all right, Net, you're 18. I said, can you tell us like what it was when you were 12? And the student goes, oh, I said, but that was only 6 years ago. Are you the same person now that you were 12? No. I said, then what do you think you'll be like when you're 30? Ah, good point. Or when you're 50. And I said, so we get a series of journeys when based upon our experience, how we try to bring all of that in and how we try to ground ourselves in what's around us and who we are. And so it is now at our age, all of us, we're going to get more stuff out there. Hopefully, we're going to handle it better than some of the people did we're going to be reading about. All right. Now, it says the exiles brought a number of scrolls from the royal archives in Jerusalem. They brought them to Babylon. They were studied and they edited. Now, here's the key sentence he wrote down here. But the scribes did not regard these writings as sacrosanct and felt free to add new passages. Key word, felt free to add new passages, altering them to fit their changed circumstances. Now, when these people are in Babylon, it's important to remember that there were two basic groups that we now agree upon that were writing in Babylon. Just about everybody agrees with this. About everything else, it becomes a big mish. One was a group of priests. And by the way, every religion has this. A group of priests or people who find that rituals and the way they are done is absolutely essential and important. There are certain ways you hold your hands. I remember one night, this is embarrassing. This is really embarrassing. My first year at Union Theological Seminary, we had on the first floor, we had a night where everybody had too many beers. And somebody, and I won't mention which denomination, said, hey, this is interesting. Have you ever thought of how many ways people hold their hands when they're doing a communion service? And it never dawned on me what that was all about until people from different traditions said, and remember, we still had people who had a high altar then. Some people had a high altar, and some who had a table, and then we got those who didn't have communion at all. I said, but is there a way you approach a holy space? Is there a way you light a candle? Are there certain words you must say? And we found out there were some people who really didn't say, it really didn't make much difference. And other people, and this is regardless of denomination, said, no, there is a certain way you must hold your hands. There's a certain word you must say. And if you don't hold your hands a certain way and you don't say certain words, the whole thing is invalid. I was shocked by that. How naive I was. And by the way, just to share with you, there are some clergy who hold their hands like this, hold their hands like this, hold their hands like this. There are some who make blessings by touching, the old rabbinic way, some who make the sign of the cross, and some who just hold their hands and do nothing. It is amazing the number of ways, just in Christianity, a person who's going to have communion is going to hold their hands. And of course, there are numbers of ways people interpret communion. They can do it like we do, simply a meal of welcome and a meal of friendship, versus the paganization of Christianity when it becomes high holy mysteries, in which there's incense and things must be done a certain way. But you're going to find in every religion, there are those who say there are certain words that must be said correctly and appropriately. There's certain ways hands must be held well, and certain times you must bow. That predates Christianity. And so you need to know that in every religion, there are those who take this and they get very upset, very, very upset if things aren't followed exactly right. Now, what they would do at All Souls, I have no idea. Yes, I do. But I'm just saying there are ways. And by the way, there are certain Unitarians that have very, very, very strict ways about doing things too. I mean, every religion has this. Nobody is exempt from this. There's certain words and certain ways, and they want to keep these written down so they can be passed down. And some of this gets to be interesting. And let me just finish on this as an example. The story of Moses, I don't know if any of you ever actually read some of the stories in Exodus, but they have priestly vestments being worn in the desert. And they have certain things that are being done in the desert. And I'm thinking, did the editors not understand who was actually in the desert in the Exodus? What they did is they superimposed what they remembered from the temple in Jerusalem, and they transposed that to a bunch of peasants who had fled into the desert. Now, I'll give you an example. It's very, very, talk about Moses and the golden calf. Does anybody remember the story of Moses and the golden calf? Anybody want to share that? Anybody remember?
I remember it.
Go ahead.
Well, as Moses was leading his people across the desert out of Egypt and towards the promised land of Israel, he went up on Mount, what was it, Ararat?
Mount Sinai.
Mount Sinai, to get to receive God giving him the Ten Commandments. And what happened was while he was up there, apparently he was there quite a while. And somewhere along the way anyway, the Hebrews built and fabricated a golden calf, which they started to worship.
Okay, now let's stop right there. Okay.
Yeah, the rules.
Okay, this was a great, great story. The problem is, it probably could not have happened. First of all, let's just look at some basic science. You're going to take a look at a golden calf. First of all, you'd argue where you got the gold, and somebody said, well, all the people in Egypt who had lots and lots of money and gold, they gave them the gold so they leave because of the 10 plagues. I said, think about that. Are you going to give your gold and stuff like that to a bunch of peasants? Think about that. All right. So it's for sake of argument. All of you right now are out in the desert. All right. You're all in the desert. Let's say you got the gold. Let's say, just for sake of argument, you've got gold in your hand. How are you going to melt the gold? All right. You might want to know there is nothing anywhere in the Sinai Peninsula that you can burn that's going to get to the degree of heat that you need to melt gold. Most people are not aware of that. All right, you're going to make a fire. But to melt gold, that gold that you got supposedly in the story, to melt that gold, you need a certain amount of heat. Nothing in the Sinai, when it's burnt, was going to give you the degree of heat you need. Okay, secondly, okay, thank you, Barbara. Wow, yeah, 1948 degrees Fahrenheit. There's nothing in the Sinai that burns that hot. Nothing, never was. Number two, what are you going to put what are you going to put on top of the fire? It's called a crucible. Back then, a crucible is the size of Nanette Bartels. So let's see if I've got this straight. You ready for this? I'm saying, wait, we're fleeing for our lives through the Sea of Reeds. Stop. We need a crucible. You guys are really going to believe me. Right. You're going to say, what? Stop. We need a crucible. Why? Because we're going to need it to melt stuff. Melt what stuff? We're fleeing for our lives. How are we going to go through the sea? What are you talking about? Who's going to lug that thing? They were huge, they were heavy, and they weighed a lot. Are we clear about that? These were not some little home depot thing you brought at home and played around with from Hobby Shop or something. It's a major, major thing. So you don't have anything to get 1948 degree Fahrenheit to begin with. A crucible, who's going to lug one? Now, here's one for you. Once you finally melt the gold, what are you going to pour it in? So here's Claus again. Wait, Melissa, stop. What? We need a thingy in which to pour gold. What kind of thingy? I don't know. It's something that's like the shape of a calf. So Melissa says to me, wait a minute. You want me to get something like that in which we're going to pour gold? Why? Who's going to lug that thing? They're heavy. Am I making sense to anybody? You look at the story and it falls apart. Who's going to do that? You're fleeing for your life. The wind is blown up according to Exodus. The wind blows up from the north overnight. The Sea of Reeds clears out. The wind stops. You're screwed. So you scoot out of there. You're going to lug a thing the size of Nanette. You're going to lug a thing in which to pour. Really? I'd like to see this. Finally, are you ready for this? It turns out calves were not worshipped. This is the other thing. This comes as a big shock. Calves were never worshipped. Why? We now find from archaeology there were markings on the back of a calf because it was understood the calf was a pedestal. It was a symbolic pedestal on which God stood. You got to bull the calf because it showed the strength of the God, and it was a pedestal. The calves were pedestals, and you can see the markings were, and you're going to love this, in the kingdom of Israel in the north. They had a giant one in the front, in the south, and the giant one in the top. In the north and the south, symbolic of Yahweh guarding the north and the south and keeping Israel intact. Down below in the south in Judah, they thought this was idolatry. You should be in Jerusalem. Thank you very much. With the Temple of Solomon, not these calves. So when Israel fell, there was great, great happiness that the calves were shown as bunk. And this story got added, by the way, in Babylon by scribes from the south who still carried a thing about the north. The story itself doesn't make any sense. The facts just don't add up. So this is the kind of way, you know, when you're really discussing Bible. So what is the object of the story? Now, if you want to do something modern like I would do, I would say, forget the calf, forget the this, forget the calf. Maybe the object of the story for us is, what do you do when things take time? John said he was up there for quite a while. They got impatient. A classic example of what happens when you get impatient. You don't wait. When you don't wait, things can go bad. Does that make a good story? So from that, you can get an idea, a question about what happens, a classic story of impatience. But the story itself, taken literally, just doesn't add up when you start looking at the facts. Now, the next question you're going to raise is, what other stories don't add up? And there we go. Okay, my suggestion is, since I look at the time, that we start with page 12 and go on to 13 and 14 and 15, because this is where we get a lot more detail. And again, let me remind everybody, in antiquity, what a lot of readers of the Bible today and other holy paper don't get, the object of telling a story was not to take the story literally, it was to make a point. And we lost that today. The art of storytelling is to remember something, a point. I still think Aesop's fables are a great idea. You told this absolutely goofy story to make a point. To make a point. I do the famous story of, to show this to my students, of the rabbit and the hare. I said, this is very simple, so I make it modern. I said the tortoise, the tortoise and hare, the tortoise is living in Kendall. And the big jackrabbit is in Kendall too. And they've got to go to Los Alamos on the beach in Fort Lauderdale. They've got this big race. So off they go. Well, our tortoise is finding it hard getting out of Kendall today because the traffic is so bad. It'll take him days to get out of Kendall. Meanwhile, the jackrabbit, and I ask my students to look up what a jackrabbit looks like because they're thinking of some little bunny. They've never seen a big rabbit. I said, these things are fast and powerful. And I said, this guy decides, it's a guy, of course, decides to go to the beach, have a good time at the beach, sample all kinds of things, of fluids that have been fermented, and sampled other things as well. Kind of gets zonked out. Meanwhile, our tortoise finally gets out of Kendall, gets on the interstate, goes down, and finally gets over, and he's on the way to the beach. He's actually in Fort Lauderdale. He's got off the I-95. He's off the exit. He's heading along, lumbering along. At this point, our coked-out jackrabbit wakes up and realizes he's in a race and there's a lot of money. Look at he split off he goes. Man, look at that dude goes. He's got it. We're coming to the finish line right across from the W. By the way, just before they get to the W, on the other side of the beach, you've got Beautiful Mile. There is 1/2 mile of beach on the beach there in Fort Lauderdale where nobody who's imperfect is allowed. I don't know if you've ever seen that section of beach. They're all people there between 18 and 28 who are perfectly beautiful. Before that section and after that section, there's the rest of us. But this small section, anyway, the tortoise goes past that. He's not even looking at that. The jackrabbit is just about ready to pass the tortoise, stops and sees that beach. Yes. Wow. The tortoise is lumbering along. 5 yards before the finish line, the jackrabbit realizes he's got to go, gets in within 2 feet and dies. The cocaine was in his system a bit too much, duckies, and lost it. The object being the race is not always won by the swiftest. My class roars. They said, that's the stupidest thing. I said, but the point is made, isn't it? I said, look at Aesop. He knew if you told these wild stories, you got a good point because you're never going to forget this story. I get students to this day telling me 10 years later, they haven't forgotten that story, the stupid jackrabbit and the tortoise getting zonked out in Los Alamos. The thing about a good story, you don't remember, you don't forget a good story. It keeps you going. Look at Homer and the Iliad. Those are great stories. They're all great stories. We don't know how to tell good stories anymore. Right? Nobody remembers a sermon. Nobody remembers sermons. But a good story? Oh, wow. And so the object of a lot of these were to tell great stories that you could remember. They weren't meant to be taken literally, and we've lost that. It's an art. All right, I'll shut up. Yes, Speedos and bikinis, everyone young and hot. You should see that place, by the way. It's like this perfect, like God forbid you should be mortal. All right, so next week, we're going to take a look at more specifics. And the hope is that you can find in good stories some excellent points of view that are still relevant. Oh, my heavens. Nanette is looking out the window, and we've just seen 900 feet of snow fall in her backyard.
It's the guy who's come to plow my driveway, but the snow's not even half over. I guess he's doing bit by bit.
You hope. The word is hope. This is a word. This is a good story about hope. Nanette is snowed in with 900 feet of snow, but she hopes the snow will get good. I like that. Remember that. I
did ask him to plow a little area for the dog so he can do his business right by the door.
Good. All right. So let's say goodbye to everybody this morning. John up in Port Orange, Nanette in tropical Connecticut, Melissa and Toby. Toby, good morning. And Pat over in, are you sure it didn't get 15 or 18 degrees in Tampa? Oh. And we get Mary Grimmy, who lives right below you. You're in Wesley Hill. She's in Tampa. Pat in Forest Hill. Barbara Young in South Miami with shrimp. Oh, first time in ever. Oh, excuse me. Excuse me. Were you really at the parties there with the Golden Wonder?
Won't know until Sue Gray's report comes out.
Will it be honest, the report, do you think?
It'll be factual, but it'll be light, I think, on any kind of, it won't say this, you know, it'll say these people were there and these people, and it started at this time and stopped at this time. And that's fine.
Will the police be more specific?
I don't even know if the police will be more specific, but you know, what's going to happen? What the worst that would happen is the penalty for breaking those rules is a fine.
That's it for him?
That's it.
You
but
guys...
the whole thing is, the point is not, did he attend, you know, it's about just a lack of trust in the man and the government and you know.
Well, there's a there's a sad image of, you see the Queen sitting by herself in mourning. Yep. These guys are out having a sodded party. I mean, that just...
Exactly. And initially he said there were no parties. Then it was work. And then, oh, well, I was only there for 25 minutes. So, I mean, which is it? It can't be all three. And the last one gives a lie to the first two.
Of course.
So, you know, the fact that the man lied to Parliament, that should be enough. But people want, no, we wait for the report.
We've just been through all of that. We're used to this now, unfortunately. Yeah, I didn't say that. Kind of behave. Roy, we see there's some sun behind you out in the woods. Holly and AJ, do we see some sun? By the way, I have to say, I'm always amazed at Ron, Roy, and Doug. They get up at the crack of dawn. No.
Let me tell you. Sun's going down.
Oh, all right. We got, how is the distance? Hey, we ought to check that out. What is the distance between somebody look this up real quick. The distance between Bellingham, Washington and Munich, Germany. What would be the distance between those two?
5,000 miles.
Is that amazing what you can do today? Look at this, 5,000 miles, and we're
still... More than that. There's more than that.
Yeah, way more. Let me look it up.
Okay, this is fun. Let's see what we do. This is crazy.
It's like 4,000 miles from New York to Los Angeles, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I would say it's probably 8,000.
Los Angeles.
Yeah, let's see what comes up.
What'd you get?
Having trouble finding it.
Munich is this tiny little hamlet, and
with a little bit of beer.
Yeah.
It's actually not as much as I thought. It's only 5,199 miles. I would have thought like 8,000.
Yeah, I thought 8 as well.
Is that going over the top of the world? You know, the arc, or around straight?
That's a good question. Let me go back and find it again.
But you know, the point is, it's zoomed. Look at this. We've got Wisconsin. We've got Bellingham, Washington. We've got Connecticut. We've got that place off the River Thames, a little place called London. Oh, he doesn't live in London, though. I've got to remember that. Yes. And we got Forest Hills, New York. We've got Tampa. Mary Grimmy is in Tampa. We've got Bobby Vance is up in Kissimmee. Good morning, Bobby Vance. Karen Paul is in Coral Gables. Maureen is down near the farmland. Melissa's out by southern in Kendall. I think that's Tony Lee. She's in Miami Lakes, and Danny is also in
Forest Hills.
Okay, Forest Hills. So that's a wild, wild stretch, and we can all do that regularly now because of Zoom. In many ways, I am so glad we're not limited to the old way of doing things 2 years ago, where a congregation was just a plot of ground in a certain spot. Really, we would never be able to do any of this. And we get people like Holly and AJ, who are obviously certifiable. They're up in Wisconsin, and then they have this place in the desert. They go from one extreme to the other. This is a wild group, but we can enjoy all of that because of Zoom. If you told me this was possible 3 years ago, I would have blanched. But it is amazing to me how much we can do that. So how much is the distance again then from Bellingham to?
It was 5,199 miles.
Okay, and England, how much from where you live, Ron, to Miami? There it is. There, he's got it on the map. Look at that.
It's
Whoa!
About 4,000 miles.
From London to here?
Yep.
Wow. Whoa. That is absolutely incredible. Look at all the mileage we're doing. So we've got to do a thing from Bellingham to Munich, Munich and Bellingham to Miami, and London and Miami. That's a lot of miles, folks.
Yep.
And then we've got the shrimp. Be safe and well. We're off and running now for several months. I'm glad to see you all. Good reminders of what start out to be very innocently get very convoluted very quickly. Sounds like Humanity 101 all over again. So
hey,
I see you.
What's our reading assignment for next week?
Okay, next week, yeah, we're going to be looking at page. Yeah, we're still in chapter 1. You want to look at page?
I think my pages might be different than your pages. Are you in chapter 1 or chapter 2?
We're in chapter 1. Chapter 1, pages 12, 13, 14, and 15 for next class.
Okay.
I'll put it out too. I'll put out an email. Chapter 1, we're going to be there for a while, Melissa.
Okay, got it.
Oh, for those of you who want to look ahead, chapter 2 is all about wisdom literature. My ask of all of you is, if you have a couple of wisdom passages from the book of Proverbs or from Sufi or from any other thing that you like, 1 or 2 passages or phrases that are wisdom, we don't deal with that much. And so it might be nice if we had class shares when we come to chapter 2 of something that keeps you grounded. A passage or 2 or a verse or 2 that keeps you grounded. There are probably lots, but if you could pick 1 or 2 to share with us that helps keep you grounded, think about that. That'd be a nice thing to look forward in the next few weeks. Okay, so think about that. Is there a saying or verse or passage? I can think of several, but 1 or 2 that keeps you specifically grounded, regardless of the source. I keep on thinking of Rumi, and I keep on thinking of Ecclesiastes, which is interesting, and maybe one from Jesus himself. But I mean, there's all kinds of things out there that just share with those, see what we come up with. Okay, I'll send the chapter 1, 12, 13, 14, and 15 for next class. Be safe and well. Those of you in the non-tropics, be careful. Those of us in Miami, it'll be a cold night. All right, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Watch out for those iguana sickles.
Yeah.